Hello, and thank you for joining us for this very important webinar. We also want to thank the organizations that have partnered with PSBA in co-sponsoring this event, including the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators, the Pennsylvania Principals Association, and the Pennsylvania State Education Association. Also, a special thank you to CM Region Insurance Company for underwriting this webinar.
As an insurance provider focusing on schools, the staff of CM Regent knows firsthand how important school safety is. Ensuring the safety of our children is priority one. We are pleased to be a part of this program today.
The tragic events at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida have opened a floodgate of emotions and concerns from members of each of our organizations. This joint webinar is partly in response to the many questions each of us have been answering. We know the topic of school safety is everyone's top priority, whether you're directly in the classroom, in the administration, or sitting on your elected school board.
We are pleased to be joined today by an international expert on the topic of threat assessment, targeted violence, and violence prevention. Dr. Marisa R. Randazzo is Managing Partner of Sigma Threat Management Associates, and she will be walking us through best practices on assessing and managing threatening situations. We believe this webinar will be a very practical and proactive guide to helping schools prevent tragic events like the ones we have seen far too often across the country.
At this time, we'll turn things over to the staff to walk you through a few housekeeping items before we turn it over to Dr. Randazzo.
Dr. Randazzo, as you have heard, is the managing partner of Sigma. She's also the current director of threat assessment for Georgetown University and was previously the chief research psychologist in the U.S. Secret Service. Dr. Randazzo has served as a subject matter expert in testimony before the Connecticut Governor Daniel Malloy's Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, as a reviewer for the White House Federal Guides to High-Quality Emergency Plans, and as a member of the American Psychological Association's expert panel on preventing gun violence. Let's get started. Dr. Randazzo, thank you for joining us, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Brianna, and I wanted to thank all the associations involved with the opportunity to talk with you here this evening. I want to spend a little bit of time giving just a little bit more background on how long I've worked in this field, and we're going to spend the time that we've got tonight talking about preventing school shootings, how it is possible to prevent school shootings in the U.S., why it is possible to prevent school shootings in the U.S., and to really walk you through some fundamentals of a process known as school threat assessment, which makes prevention feasible and quite manageable to achieve. So just a little bit more about my background and the work that I bring to this field. I've been working within the field of behavioral threat assessment for close to 25 years now. Initially first with the U.S. Secret Service, and then since then with Georgetown University and also with our consulting practice at Sigma Threat Management. What I'm going to be talking with you about in this webinar is the study that we conducted when I was with the U.S. Secret Service and that we did in partnership with the U.S. Department of Education, and it's known as the Safe School Initiative. The Safe School Initiative is still recognized as the largest federal study of school shooters and school shootings in the United States. And the findings that we released several years ago when this report first came out are still just as true today as they were then. In the numerous shootings we have seen over the past several years that occurred since we completed our data collection, we have seen that the same behavioral patterns repeat and reoccur. And the information I'm going to be sharing with you today is there to really help you understand how school shootings can be prevented. And after walking you through the major findings of what we discovered in studying school shootings and in talking with school shooters in prison, I'm going to walk you through the fundamentals of this school threat assessment process. Now, in the wake of the Parkland shooting in Florida on February 14th, we have heard a lot of discussion in recent weeks about this concept of school threat assessment. So I'm going to explain to you what it is, what constitutes best practices for school threat assessment, the elements of effective programs, and other things that we can do at the same time to help to support our school environment and to help make threat assessment as feasible and as effective as possible. So we'll start with the basis of what we know about school shootings and the implications for prevention. I'll explain the fundamentals of school threat assessment and the elements of a program. And then the other things we can do piece that I just mentioned, I want to give a little more clarity to. And that is that we know that school threat assessment programs can function particularly well in schools and school districts that pay attention to how positive their school climate is, how safe schools feel, not only to students, but to employees and to parents and visitors as well. And we're talking not just about physical safety and how safe a school feels physically, but we're also talking about whether it feels like an emotionally safe place, meaning are situations handled fairly, is information treated objectively, and are rules implemented the same across the board. So there are things that we can do after we talk about school threat assessment and the nuts and bolts of what a program looks like and the functions it entails, to also think about other things that we can do to support and help enhance school climates overall. So my goal in conducting this webinar with you today is to give you some concrete information and guidelines about things that you can do in your schools and in your districts and in your communities, either to start to establish school threat assessment programs or to see if there are aspects of programs you may already have in place that you can add to, that you can enhance to make them particularly effective for school violence prevention. So let me start with first with a report that is available online. I'm going to be talking about some highlights of this report, but this report is known as the final report and findings of the Safe School Initiative. And again, that was the study that the Secret Service and Department of Education collaborated on a number of years ago. I'm going to be going into details about the study and about some of the major findings, but there are a lot more details available in this report, including details on some of the major aspects I'm going to be discussing, as well as other findings that are not as directly relevant to our discussion here today. So I encourage you to download this report. It's available as a free PDF. It's available on our website at sigmatma.com in the About section under Resources. But it's also available at the secretservice.gov website, at the ed.gov website for U.S. Department of Education. And also you can simply Google Final Report and Findings of the Safe School Initiative and find it in a number of locations. So I encourage you to download it and to read it as well. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the origins of this study, because it really marked a unique collaboration that we had never seen before in U.S. history. A little bit of background about what even brought the Secret Service to studying school shootings is that prior to the Columbine High School shooting in 1999, the Secret Service had actually undertaken a research effort to better understand people who attacked public officials and public figures, who engaged in assassinations or assassination attempts, not only of elected officials, but other people who had some public status, such as high-profile CEOs, celebrities, and professional athletes. So the Secret Service undertook a behavioral analysis of individuals and of situations where there had been an attack on someone who was chosen because they were a public figure, because they had some public status. And the findings that the Secret Service discovered in that behavioral analysis really helped to dramatically enhance how the Secret Service went about investigating people who were threatening to do harm to public officials, to public figures, to celebrities, to professional athletes. And it has enhanced those efforts to this day. So the work that the Secret Service did in that behavioral research still informs the threat analysis work that they do today. In the wake of the Columbine High School shooting, the Secret Service director reached out to the Secretary of Education and suggested a partnership where the two agencies could work together to conduct a similar analysis of attacks on U.S. schools, to look at school shootings and school shooters, and to see if there was any information that we could derive using that same type of behavioral research techniques to see what we could learn about school shootings that might help us do a better job at prevention. And so it was agreed between the U.S. Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education that they would collaborate on the study, known now as the Safe School Initiative. And it really was the first time in history that those two agencies had partnered together, and they partnered together toward a common goal of helping to make U.S. schools safer and to help inform prevention efforts to stop school shootings and reduce their likelihood. So we embarked in 1999, a team of us from U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Secret Service to study school shootings around the country. And in total, we ended up studying 37 school shootings involving 41 school shooters. Now, the data that we talk about and the findings that we report in this final report and findings of the Safe School Initiative really focus on our deep dive analysis of all of those events. And that information came from looking at the criminal investigations, talking with prosecutors, talking with witnesses, gathering other information that was available about those attacks. And that really laid the data foundation for our findings. But in addition to that, in addition to doing this deep dive analysis of each of these incidents, we had the opportunity to talk with 10 school shooters in prison, those who lived through their attacks, and spoke with them about their perspective on why they carried out their school shootings, what they were trying to accomplish, what had motivated them, whether or not they thought they wanted to be stopped. And so the information that we got from those interviews, while it was not systematic across the 37 school shootings that we studied, the information we got from those 10 interviews has helped to supplement the research findings we have here with individual stories and accounts and perspectives from some of these school shooters about why they thought they had to or felt they needed to engage in school violence or felt they had no other option left except to engage in school violence. So I'll share with you some of those stories as we go through the findings today. The major question that we were trying to get a handle on in studying all of these attacks across the United States was really whether or not these shootings were impulsive, because there had been so much media coverage up until that point about school shooters just snapping and deciding one morning to come in and engage in the school shooting, and that no one had seen anything coming. There was no way to get a warning sign or some precursor event to indicate some concerns. We wanted to get a handle on whether or not that was in fact accurate. As we studied these 37 shootings involving 41 perpetrators, we found that that is rarely the case. Rarely do school shooters just snap. Instead, they actually think out their attacks beforehand, and they plan them beforehand. And they actually follow what is a fairly well-established and observable progression of behaviors. And it's known in our field now as the pathway to violence, meaning most individuals who carry out school attacks follow the same progression of behavior from first coming up with an idea to engage in some harm, and then developing a plan to carry out that idea. Now, sometimes the initial idea and the more detailed plan look very similar. But sometimes, as the student or other person of concern starts to do some research, their plan evolves. So the original idea and the eventual plan look different. But following coming up with an idea and then developing a more detailed plan, the next step that these shooters engage in is to acquire some means of mass lethality. Now, in virtually all of these events, there's at least some firearms involved, but there are often multiple firearms or firearms plus something else, whether it's pipe bombs or a cache of knives. In some cases, we saw napalm. So they look for ways to acquire the means of mass lethality, or if they already have access to weapons, as some of them did, they had to figure out how to get those weapons to the place where they wanted to do harm. And then the last step in this pathway to violence is implementing their attack plan itself. So the four components of the pathway, as we look at it in individual cases and as we see it in research studies like this, is idea, plan, acquisition, and then implementation. In short order, when we conduct a threat assessment on a student of concern in school or on anyone whose behavior raises concern about potential for school violence, we are trying to figure out, are they on this pathway to violence? And if so, why? And usually the why has to do with personal problems, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But we try to figure out if they're on a pathway to violence and figure out the best ways to get them off that pathway and to keep them off that pathway. In the field of threat assessment, as we've practiced it, and I practice it for over 2 decades now, it is quite feasible to get someone off a pathway to violence and to keep them off a pathway to violence. Let me give you a quick example before we go on. And talking about this pathway to violence and the difference between ideas and plans. So there was one school shooter that we talked to in prison when we were conducting this study. And he had been bullied extensively for quite some time in his high school. He eventually had gone to his adoptive mother, who was actually a school official in the school district, and asked for her help. And she suggested that he talk directly with his school principal and his vice principal, and that they cared about bullying and they would help him. And he did just that. And for a while, the school principal addressed it directly with the several students who had been bullying this young student. He was now a junior in high school, who had been bullying him for a while. And for a while, things improved a lot for the student who had been bullied. So things got better, the bullying stopped, and in fact, the principal and vice principal made a note of the fact that his disciplinary infractions were down, his grades had improved, and they commended him on the good work. But a few weeks later, the bullying resumed, and this time it was a little bit more secretive and a little bit more vicious because the students who were engaging in the bullying behavior were angry that they had been caught and reprimanded. When it started back up again, this student went back to the principal and the vice principal and said, it was gone for a while and things were much better, but now it's back and it feels like it's worse. The guidance he got back from the school administrators at that point was, just try to ignore it. Just try to ignore the students and maybe it'll go away and things will get better. What this student told us from prison after his school shooting was that he thought it was good advice and he understood it, but that it was nearly impossible to try to ignore someone who was next to him all the time, day in and day out, ripping things out of his backpack, ripping open his binder, throwing rocks at his head, slamming him against lockers, putting his head into toilets, etc. And when we talked to him in prison, he told us it was at that moment when he felt like he had gone to what he called all the appropriate people that he was supposed to go to when he was having a problem in school, and that they had done about all that they could. And that was the impression he got, was that there was no other help he could get from, as he called it, the appropriate people, and that he would have to solve this problem himself. So his idea on the pathway to violence, his initial idea was simply just to bring a gun to school and to make sure that these kids who had been bullying him for so long saw him with a gun, knew he was a tough guy or would think he was a tough guy, and they would back off. So that was his original idea. Now, what happened at that point on his pathway to violence was that he shared this idea with a couple of his friends. And this gets to the finding down at the bottom of this particular slide. And that across most of these shootings, the school shooters told other people beforehand that they were planning a school shooting, that they were thinking about engaging in violence in school, that they were planning it out. They told, and in our study, they told people in multiple ways. So they told people face-to-face, friends face-to-face. They disclosed plans in social media, on journal assignments, in homework assignments, in written form, in verbal form. They told other people. Now, one of the implications that we take from this is that the people who usually know first are fellow students or peers of the school shooter. So I will reemphasize this later on, but one key point I want to touch on right now is that from this finding, we know that students in school are absolutely vital to prevention efforts because they are likely to hear long before an adult in school, or even when adults never hear. They will hear about concerning behavior. They will hear about friends who are planning something violent. They will hear about friends who are considering suicide. They will hear about friends who are trying to help another friend who's struggling with some circumstances. So students are going to know long before an adult in school may ever know that there's a concern. So one message we can give starting today is to encourage all of our students in schools that they're a vital part of prevention efforts. They're a vital part of keeping schools safe because they may become aware of problems long before the adults in school have any sense that there's a problem going on. So let me get back to the example I was talking about before. So in the case of this young man whose idea had been to just bring a gun to school, make sure the bullies saw him with the gun, and appear tough, hoping that they would back off. As I mentioned, he told 2 friends, and the feedback he got from those friends changed his plan considerably. So he happened to live in a part of the country where hunting was common and where most boys and young men his age had a fair amount of experience using hunting weapons and engaging in hunting. And this young man happened to not have that experience, but there were shotguns in his home. His adoptive mother was an avid hunter. So he knew there was access to weapons from his own home. He himself didn't have any experience using weapons. And he told his 2 friends this idea, and the feedback, the reaction he got from these 2 friends was, if you actually want to stop this, this isn't going to do it. If you actually want to look tough and get these bullies to back off, this isn't going to be enough. In fact, if you just show up with the weapon, they'll be able to tell that you're not familiar with it, and they'll laugh at you even more. They convinced him at that point that instead of just carrying a weapon to school and appearing with a weapon, if he really wanted to stop the bullies, they convinced him that he needed to fire the weapon in school, and preferably to fire it at people. Now, these 2 friends of his got so involved in helping the student plan out his school shooting that originally there were a list of 3 or 4 bullies who had really been making the student's life difficult, and those were his targets. But as the 3 of them now started discussing these plans, the 2 boys that were helping essentially said, you know, there are a list of 8 other individuals that we don't like very much. 11 other individuals that we don't like very much. So while you're shooting in school, if you happen to see any of them, we'd appreciate you shooting those individuals as well. So at that point, the plan changed from just bringing a gun to school to actually firing a weapon in school and at people. And the target list went from the 3 bullies who had been making this one student's life difficult to a list of 11 individuals in school, including the school principal, who the 3 boys together didn't like for one reason or another. So this pathway to violence is illustrated well in this particular example, as the original idea was one thing, a plan was different, and it also helps to illustrate the level of information sharing. Let me give you a little bit more information about this particular case before we go on to the rest of the findings. In this particular case, there was word about what this student was going to do that traveled to such an extent that on most mornings at this particular school, there was an open atrium, and there was a mezzanine level outside the library that overlooked the lobby. Most students would congregate in the lobby before the beginning of the school day, around different sections of the lobby with their groups of friends. And on a given morning, on most mornings, maybe there would be 3 or 4 students in the mezzanine overlooking the lobby, outside the library that overlooked the lobby. Word about what the student had done or had been planning to do, word about what the student was planning to do in terms of planning his school shooting, had circulated so much that on the morning of his school shooting, instead of there being 3 or 4 students on the mezzanine overlooking the lobby, there were 24 students, 24 students who were up there, all of whom knew something big and bad was going to happen, but most of whom knew exactly what was going to happen, that this student was going to bring a shotgun into school and shoot the kids who had been bullying him. So it was a powerful example of just how much information can circulate beforehand about ideas and plans for school shootings. And from our vantage point, we see all of this as an opportunity for prevention. The fact that these school shootings are planned out in advance and they typically follow this pathway to violence, and the fact that school shooters tell other people beforehand, all of these findings allow us an opportunity to prevent, an opportunity to hear about these rumors that someone might be planning something violent, and to gather more information to figure out if they are in fact on this pathway to violence, and if so, why. Some other major findings that are helpful to show how prevention is possible looking across these school shootings is that most of the school shooters had seriously troubled adults in their lives beforehand. So the vast majority, I think it's around 93%, had seriously concerned at least one adult in their life in the weeks and months before their attack for some very troubling behavior. But around 3/4 of all of these school shooters had actually troubled and concerned multiple adults. So a coach, school counselor, a teacher, a parent, multiple people in that student's life were significantly worried about that student before they carried out their attack. But oftentimes, those who were worried didn't know where to bring this concern, didn't know where to report it, didn't know who to tell, and weren't exactly sure necessarily what was going on. They were troubled and significantly concerned, but not quite sure what to make of it. So it's important because these are not necessarily invisible students who have carried out these attacks and who are carrying out these attacks. These are often students who are known to multiple adults as troubled, or more important, as struggling, as having difficulty, and as in needing some sort of care or attention or intervention, but often the question as to what. I'm not sure what I'm looking at, but I do know I'm worried. So when we build a threat assessment program in schools, or at the school district level, or even at the community level, which some communities are starting to do, we're essentially building a capacity, building a team of trained individuals who can respond to these reports of, I'm worried, I'm not quite sure what's going on, I'm not quite sure what I'm seeing, but I am worried. They're also a team that's trained to be able to respond to the more specific reports of, I heard a friend of mine who's talking about school shootings, or they're doing a lot of research on school shootings now and I don't know why, or they've read up a lot on school shooters and feel like they can identify with why they engaged in their attacks, and that worries me. A school threat assessment team or program is trained to address all of those situations and to gather more information and figure out what's going on, and figure out if this person might be on a pathway to violence and how to get them off and keep them off. There's a powerful example of this finding and the next one, which I'll go through first and then talk about that example. What we saw is across vast majority of the school shooters we studied is that they had significant difficulty coping with losses or failures or some loss of status or humiliation they were facing. For many of them, they were facing multiple losses or failures. Now, to adults, they may seem like losses that from our perspective are minor, are easy to get over, the breakup of a first girlfriend, for example, or first boyfriend. But to these students, they felt overwhelming. They felt like they couldn't see a way out. They had exhausted their ability to cope. And in fact, a number of them were actively suicidal as part of their planning of school shootings. So across so many of them, we saw either students who engaged in school shootings and had planned to kill themselves in the process. It was actually part of their plan. Or they were hoping to be killed by responding police. They were hoping for what is known as a suicide by cop scenario. Some of them had actually tried to kill themselves beforehand and failed to do so, and were looking for the school shooting as a way to be killed in the process. So the example I have that helps to illustrate both of these findings here comes from a student who was a senior and had submitted a poem to his English teacher for a homework assignment. And the contents of the poem were: sinking into bed, homicidal thoughts filling my head, suicidal thoughts not gone but fleeing, because it's other people's death I'm seeing. Suicide and homicide, homicide and suicide. Into sleep I'm sinking. Why me I'm thinking. Homicidal and suicidal thoughts intermixing. I know my life is not worth fixing. Now, I'd ask you to take a moment and think, whether you're an English teacher or not, think to yourself, what do I make of this poem and what does it say to me? What I'll tell you is a couple of the impressions that we learned about was that the English teacher was very concerned, understandably, by the contents of this poem. And clearly, this is a poem where the student had taken time to craft it. It was well written. It was handed in on time. But this wasn't the only behavior that raised concern for the English teacher. This poem was actually one of a series of assignments that the same student had submitted to his English teacher over the course of his semester in this creative writing class. And all these submissions centered around the same theme. They centered around this dilemma that he felt that he was experiencing as to whether suicide or homicide was the better solution to the personal despair that he was experiencing in his life. Now, in this particular case, the school teacher was very worried and raised this matter with the school principal to seek guidance on what to do. The school principal was similarly very concerned about what might be going on for the student, and together they went to the school board. And in this particular case, in this region of the country, the school board asked a couple of questions to really focus on whether this was a school problem. And the school board asked, how are his disciplinary infractions? How's his disciplinary record? And he actually had a very clean record. He was almost never in trouble at school. They also asked, well, how are his grades? Is this really part of an academic failing? And they said, no, his grades are quite good. So the school said, as far as we can see, this is not a school disciplinary problem. It is not a grade or GPA or academic problem. This is really a personal problem, and this is a matter for his family to address, not for the school to address. And as we went through the investigation of this particular school shooting, there was no indication we could really see that there had been outreach to the family to express extreme concern from the school. I think the school really felt like they weren't sure what they could do. In this particular instance, when we talked to this school shooter in prison, he helped explain the sort of sequence of events for him. That for months he had been feeling this level of despondency and feeling like he was hopeless, feeling like he saw no way out, no improvement in his future whatsoever, and that he had been wrestling with this dilemma, as he had documented in those many homework assignments, of whether suicide or homicide was the better solution, the better out, or the better ending for him. And he decided that the best way out of this despair for him was for him to commit suicide. His rationale was that the only person that would be killed would be him, that it would end his personal pain, and that other people would be safe. So he decided to kill himself, and one night he tried to do so, but he failed to do so. And when we talked to him in prison, he recounted for us that he had already felt like a loser before engaging in this before engaging in the suicide attempt. He had already felt like a loser and felt like he was at the lowest point in his life. And then he tried to commit suicide and he failed. And he told us at that point that he didn't realize he could feel any lower than he already did, but he did. He said, I felt like I was such a loser, I couldn't even get that right. I couldn't even commit suicide the right way. And so in his mind, he felt like he was left with only one option, and that was to engage in an attempt to kill others. So for this young man, he brought his weapon into school, he hid it in his locker, and he actually waited until the end of the school day. We see a lot of school shootings happen oftentimes in the morning, in the beginning hours of the day. But this student decided to wait till the very end of the school day, and he went back and forth in his mind throughout the day about whether he should or whether he shouldn't. And I'll get back to that ambivalence in just a moment. So he talked to himself back and forth about whether he should carry out the school shooting or not. And he waited until the end of the school day when most of the classrooms had been emptied out, and a lot of students who had already left the building and were on their way home. And he went back to that English classroom. English had been his last class that day, and his teacher was in the classroom and a custodian who was cleaning the chalkboards, and he shot and killed them both. What he explained to us in prison, his rationale for killing two people, was that he thought he couldn't succeed in killing himself. He was hoping that when police responded to his school shooting that they would kill him, but he also reasoned that if that didn't happen, in his state, the laws were such that if he killed two or more people, he should get the death penalty. So he was even thinking further ahead that if he couldn't have a suicide by cop scenario, that he would have a suicide by criminal justice system, as it were, and essentially get the state to kill him because he was unable to kill himself. So when we talked to him in prison, because he had carried out these shootings when he was under the age of 18, he was not eligible for the death penalty, and he is now serving multiple consecutive life sentences in prison where he is. So the example helps to underscore a couple of things, and that is that he had been worrying a number of people beforehand, but also that he had been actively suicidal. And in so many of these cases, we see what is really what appears to be a very fine line between suicide and homicide in these particular school shootings. Now, I want to put a very important caveat on that point, and that is that the vast majority of people who are suicidal, who are despondent and thinking of taking their own life, are not at risk of hurting other people. But when we are looking at a case, when we're looking at a student or someone else who's raising concern, and we're worried about the potential for harming others, for violence to others, we are going to look actively to see if they are, in fact, despondent or suicidal. Because people who are at that point, who don't care how their life goes from this point forward, who think any change is preferable, even death, even prison, those people may be capable of a lot greater lethality, or certainly not as impacted by deterrence as other people might be who do care about how things are for them going forward. So when we are worried about a particular student or other person and their potential for violence to others, in a threat assessment case, we ask about, are they feeling despondent? Are they actively suicidal? Have they had suicide attempts in the past? And the good news for us is that we know a lot about how to help someone who is suicidal. We have laws in place that allow us to get them in to an emergency room or for an emergency psychiatric evaluation, even if they don't want to go, and to help stabilize that situation and help get them an evaluation and medication if that's necessary and warranted, and to help stabilize them so they remain safe, and to help move them away from that precipice that they may be experiencing. So we know a lot. We've got tools. We've got local law enforcement who can do welfare checks and do transports to ER and can actually petition for those emergency psychiatric evaluations themselves. We have tools and we have resources to help someone who is suicidal. So part of a threat assessment is looking to see, is this person that we're worried about, who might be thinking about and talking about engaging in a school shooting, for example, are they at a point of personal desperation? Because there's a lot we can do to help someone who's at that point and help them very quickly. I also mentioned a moment ago about this ambivalence that this one shooter described to us in the course of the day, and his going back and forth about whether to carry out his school shooting or not. And this ambivalence is a theme we heard across a number of these prison interviews we did with school shooters, that they described an experience to us prior to carrying out their school shooting that I think is very important to understand, and that they described feeling really ambivalent or torn about carrying out their shooting. And what I mean, and this is before the fact, what I mean about ambivalent is not indifferent. It's not that they didn't care. They actually had conflicting feelings, in that part of them felt like they wanted to carry out the school shooting or had to carry out the school shooting, or they couldn't see any other option left except carrying out the school shooting. And part of them at the same time didn't want to go through with it, and they wanted to be stopped. And a number of them offered the observation that they think part of the reason they told so many people beforehand about their violent plans was that, in a way, looking back, they think it was a cry for help, and they had hoped someone would stop them. That they had gone public with these plans and now kind of had a reputation to uphold, or a persona that they couldn't back down from, that they would look even more of a loser if they backed away from their own violent plans, but that by broadcasting them, they were hoping someone would pick up on them and stop them from doing what they were thinking about doing. When we work on active threat cases, and my colleagues and I in the field of threat assessment work on these cases as often as we provide training to help schools and campuses and workplaces set up these teams, we work on active cases all the time as well. when we have a case in front of us with a student or someone else who may be thinking about or planning to engage in some violence, we always keep in mind that ambivalence, and we try to look for the part of them that doesn't want to do this, that may just feel like they have run out of other options, and we help them actively to look for other options, other ways to solve the problems that have got them to consider violence in the first place. So across all of the research that we did and on these 37 incidents involving 41 school shooters, from the findings that I just discussed, we believe that it is quite possible to prevent school shootings because there's information available about a person's ideas and plans for violence, that we can uncover them before harm can occur, and we can piece them together to try to figure out, is this person on a pathway to violence? Now, the challenge for threat assessment teams and threat assessment programs is that the first report is never the full story. It is a piece of information. We often find contradictory information as we go to look for more facts in a case. But that having a team means you've got multiple individuals who are trained to figure out how to get at this other information, to go have conversations after a report comes in with people who know the student or the other person of concern, who teach them, who work with them, who coach them, who interact with them, who are in a position to observe them, and to gather this other information and piece it all together. And the prevention happens, and school threat assessment teams can actively prevent violence when they try to figure out what those underlying drivers are. What are the problems that have led the student to think about violence in the first place, and how can we help the student or this other person to solve them through other means, through nonviolent means? And when we do that, we get them off the pathway to violence, and they stay off the pathway to violence. When we help them solve those underlying problems, their interest in or focus on violence typically goes away. But we'll often monitor a case for quite some time to make sure they're still doing okay, and to make sure that they still are connected with resources that can help them to be on a better path and succeed going forward, rather than feeling like they are continuing to fail. So I mentioned before, when we conduct a school threat assessment, we're gathering information to figure out if a person is on this pathway to violence. And if so, why? And how else can we solve those problems to get them off the pathway to violence? We wrote a companion report, the U.S. Secret Service and U.S. Department of Education, creating a model for threat assessment in schools. This is now known as the federal model for school threat assessment. So we use the research findings that I just discussed from the Safe School Initiative to create a model and a process that schools can follow to look into these situations when they first come to a school's attention, or come to the attention of local law enforcement, or come to the attention of a community member, and to build a process and resources to address these situations, A, to see if someone is on a pathway to violence and to get them away from that pathway to violence, and B, to also look at other things we can do to enhance an overall school climate to help make a threat assessment program particularly effective and help reduce problematic behavior in schools more generally. So I mentioned before and encouraged you to download the final report and findings of the Safe School Initiative, and I'm going to do the same thing here with the School Threat Assessment Guide. So the title is Threat Assessment in Schools, a guide to managing threatening situations and to creating safe school climates. It's also available on our website at sigmatma.com in the About section under Resources. But also, if you Google the title or look at secretservice.gov or ed.gov, those sites have the PDFs available as well. So it's a free PDF. Again, it's a fairly short read, and I encourage you to download it and read it, as it provides some excellent guidance for how to set up and operate school threat assessment programs, as well as the specific procedures to follow in handling a school threat assessment case. So just to be a little more specific about what we mean by threat assessment. Threat assessment in schools or workplaces or on campuses or elsewhere is a systematic fact-finding process. It includes 4 major components: efforts to identify people and situations that raise some concern about the potential for violence. Once we hear about an initial report, the second component is actively gathering information from multiple sources to try to figure out how to piece this all together. We hear a lot after attacks about the importance of connecting the dots. Our colleague at Sigma, Dr. Jeff Pollard, has emphasized that first we have to collect the dots and then connect the dots. So the second stage of school threat assessment is this fact-finding component. We're looking to see who else knows something. Who else may be concerned about this student or this person, but not yet have come forward to volunteer that concern. What I'll tell you is my experience in working on these cases for over 20 years is that even if people don't come forward on their own to express a concern, if you show up to talk to them about someone they teach or work with or are in a relationship with and they're worried, they will tell you that they are worried, and they'll do their best to tell you why, what they've seen, what they've heard, what behaviors have concerned them. So once we have an initial report, maybe coming from a student or someone who's seen something on social media, then we're going to gather information from multiple sources. We're going to collect those dots. The third component of a threat assessment process in schools and elsewhere is connecting the dots. It's actually analyzing the information that we have available. And in the school threat assessment guide that I just showed you in the slide before and encourage you to download, there are 12 specific questions that the federal model of school threat assessment recommends asking in these cases to help a team to analyze this information, to help piece it all together and connect those dots, and to also show where there may be some missing information and where efforts should go back to see what else is available, what other information is available. So in addition to the 12 analytical questions or key investigative questions as they're referred to in the federal school threat assessment model, they also include 2 assessment questions, or a primary assessment question and the secondary one that we recommend. So the primary question is really having the team answer, is this person on a pathway to violence? Given everything we know, do we think that they pose a threat of violence? And put another way we can think about it is, are they on that pathway to violence? So based on the information that we have gathered and synthesized, as a team, do we think this person poses a threat of violence? Does their behavior suggest there's some idea or plan that they're on a pathway to violence, that they're moving toward implementation? And if so, then we go to this 4th step of school threat assessment, where we actively develop a plan and implement a plan to reduce risk, to manage the person and situation of concern, to find ways to connect them with resources to help them solve those underlying problems, to monitor how they're doing, and in some extreme cases, to contain them so they can't do capacity for harm, such as a referral for an emergency psychiatric evaluation if we need to. So these components comprise the threat assessment process. And in schools, we see this done very well, whether at the school level or at the district level. And in some cases, it can be done at the community level as well. So these are the 4 components. When we actually talk about establishing a school threat assessment program, we have observed that there are a couple of elements that make these programs function particularly effectively. So first and foremost, it's important for whatever entity, a school-based team or a district level team or even a community team, that they have some authority vested in that team to engage in threat assessment procedures. So they have some authority to gather information, to ask about people in situations that have raised some concern, to put this all together, and then take action on behalf of that school or the school district or the community to reduce risk and to maintain safety. So it's important to give whatever entity, a team or program, with the authority that they can engage in threat assessment procedures. We also think that having a multidisciplinary team is a critical component to effective school threat assessment. Now, at the very core, multidisciplinary, this sort of interdisciplinary aspect is very important, because this isn't just a school problem or just a law enforcement problem or just a mental health problem or just a community problem. Problems like this of people who are engaging in violence can touch on all these different silos. And what we often see in cases after the fact is that concerning information was in one silo and different concerning information was in a different silo, but no one had all of the pieces to the puzzle or all of the dots collected. So having a multidisciplinary representation of membership on the team actually helps threat assessment work more efficiently, because you've got an easier way to seek out information from those silos, because you've got people from the silos represented on the team. You've got different perspectives to help analyze and make the assessment effectively and thoroughly. And then with different disciplines represented on the team, you also have arguably easier access to case management or intervention resources you may need to employ in cases where you think someone is on this pathway to violence. So at a very basic level, the areas that we think are important to represent on the team are obviously school administrators, mental health professionals, whether it's a school counselor or school psychologist or just a mental health professional from the community who's volunteering her or his time to be able to assist the school. What you want is expertise that can help explain behavior, help explain diagnoses if they are relevant in a case, help explain what medication might mean or someone going off their medication, what behavior you could expect from that. So having that expertise represented on the school can help explain behavior in some cases, as well as think through some mental health related intervention resources if those are necessary. And then law enforcement is critical to have on these teams as well. Many teams include their school resource officer, but oftentimes schools and districts don't have school resource officers, in which case it's important to have a liaison from local law enforcement who can sit in on the team or who the team can easily access as they need for particular cases. Now, for district level teams, we may see a different configuration that also includes HR, so it can handle all threats. And these are important really for any team that is developed, whether it's a school-based team or a district level team or a community level team. And that is that you want to make sure that the team has the authority to look at any threat that may be impacting the school, whether it comes from a student or former student, which is what we often think of most when we think of school shootings. But it could also come from a former employee. It could come from a parent. It could come from an estranged domestic partner of one of the employees at school who had to get a restraining order, but that person knows that they can always find their estranged domestic partner at the school, at work, for example. It may come from completely outside the school. So a multidisciplinary team should have the authority and should have training to handle all threats, whether they are from students or former students, employees, former employees, or from some tangential or completely external relationship to the school. So district level teams and some school-based teams often may also include a representative of HR or labor relations or employee assistance program and the like. And then you can also include ad hoc members. So for student cases where there may be some, a special education dynamic, you can have, or an IEP in place. You can have an education specialist who's there as a student advocate or to help explain access to resources and procedures that may need to be followed in those cases as well. So in addition to having a multidisciplinary team and authority to conduct the assessment, we think it is absolutely vital that school threat assessment teams get high quality training on threat assessment, on what the best practice procedures are for engaging in threat assessment. As I mentioned, they are documented well and explained well in this guide to threat assessment in schools from the Secret Service and Department of Education. But it can also be very, very helpful for teams to get training, and from training from individuals who have direct experience handling these cases over the course of at least several years. One of the things that unfortunately we see coming up in the wake of a lot of high profile events especially those affecting schools and campuses, is that we almost see security companies and vendors pop up overnight and hang out a shingle claiming to have expertise they don't necessarily have. When it comes to threat assessment training, there are a whole host of quality experts and individuals around the U.S. who can provide this. And I just encourage you that if you're going to pursue any sort of training or guidance on setting up programs, you quiz the people who will be doing the training about what kind of experience they have and how many cases they've handled over the course of their career and challenges they've faced. Because you want to make sure that you get people who actually know what they're doing in teaching your teams how to handle situations that in some cases arguably could be life and death situations. And then finally, school threat assessment programs need to have access to resources they can use for intervention and for monitoring. Sometimes those are going to be inside the school. Oftentimes, they may be resources that you need to access that are outside the school. including efforts to monitor individuals. One thing that we often train school threat assessment teams to do is come up with a laundry list of intervention and support resources they have available to them that are both formal and informal. So you may have individuals who are willing to serve as informal mentors in a school setting. You can think about community agencies that may be able to provide support, such as domestic violence shelters if need be. You can think about resources that are available through activities that may help to connect a student to help facilitate friendships and involvement in team sports or other extracurricular activities. But it's helpful to develop a laundry list of resources that you can access before you have a case where you need to access those right away. And it's also very helpful to think up front about how to establish liaisons with those resources and spend a couple of times going by and introducing yourself, meeting with the director of a community agency, for example, and buying them a cup of coffee and explaining what your school threat assessment team does and talking about ways that you might be able to partner together. Getting someone's mobile number so you can reach them after hours when sometimes cases come up and you need to access some support and some help. So making sure you've got a list of places you can turn and people you can access to help with intervention and also to help monitor cases as they go forward. Even when students are separated from a school or employees are separated from their workplace or school workplace, we know that separation never guarantees safety. So we need to make sure that we have ways to monitor those cases and those individuals even after they leave our school environment. And that's where coordination with local law enforcement and other community agencies can be absolutely vital, so that even if we think that they still may pose a threat of violence to others, but they have left the school community, that we have a way to pass on that concern and alert others so they can share in that monitoring as well. Now, I wanted to mention here that there are a couple of communities that are doing this effort of school threat assessment particularly well. They really stand out as I think, shining examples of how to do this well and how to build the capacity in a way that truly supports school personnel, local law enforcement, mental health personnel, and school administrators and boards who are trying to reduce school violence. So the Commonwealth of Virginia is actually a fascinating example because at a statewide level, they've actually implemented laws and supporting resources to actively engage in school threat assessment and campus threat assessment. So after their campus shooting at Virginia Tech in 2007, a couple of years after that, the legislature in Virginia passed a law that required threat assessment teams for all of their public colleges and universities. And they started to build up some capacity to help support those teams at the time. And then a couple of years ago, Virginia passed additional legislation requiring threat assessment teams for all of their public K-12 schools. And when they passed that legislation, they really stood up an infrastructure that helps schools and colleges across Virginia to engage in threat assessment in a high quality manner. So at a state level, they created a center within the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services. They actually created a dedicated center called the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety. I think that's the correct name. And through that center, they have provided resources and training to schools throughout Virginia and to colleges throughout Virginia to help them engage in threat assessment. So they created, especially for K-12, they created model school policies that school boards can adopt to help create and establish school threat assessment teams and delineate the team's responsibilities and scope of jurisdiction. They also developed model threat assessment procedures that are built very closely on the federal threat assessment model that I've outlined here and that's detailed in the guide here, the Guide to Threat Assessment in Schools. And they tailored it to meet Virginia law and other obligations under Virginia law, for example, on how to handle cases of harm to self or threats of harm to self. But they also have available as needed, an expert who is housed within the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety, who is available for individual schools to help with particular cases or to help with program development and implementation. So the state saw a need for school threat assessment, but they also bolstered the legal requirement that they had implemented with resources to make it possible for law enforcement and school personnel, administrators, school board members to access free training and to have model procedures and policy that they could build upon and adapt for their own use. There's another area across the country. There's a district level school threat assessment team in the Salem-Keizer School District, and that's in Salem, Oregon. Now, a number of years ago, shortly after we first published this guide to the federal school threat assessment model, Salem-Keizer, as a school district, developed a school-based team, but at the same time, they also developed a community-based threat assessment team. And theirs is one of the first community-based threat assessment teams that I know of in the United States. And they decided to develop this companion community-based team, recognizing that there would be limitations for the ability of the school team to be able to track cases for students once they left the school if they still posed a threat. And they also had recognized the value of how helpful the school threat assessment process was, and thought that they could mimic the same process, create the same process and capacity for their non-school cases. So they used their community team not only to help keep an eye on student cases once those students have left the school, but also to address cases of threats to their public officials, of domestic violence, of stalking in their community, of threats of workplace violence, and a whole host of similar issues. And so they've done that. Not only have they created multidisciplinary teams, but they've created interagency relationships so that their community level team accesses and includes representation from all of the critical agencies serving their community area for social services, for enforcement, for criminal justice, and for all kinds of support and access, so they can have those relationships already established at the table, as it were, and can use them as needed for intervention or for monitoring or information gathering, as the case may be. So there are a number of examples around the country of communities that are doing this well, and I point those out because we've seen in the past couple of weeks consensus building around political sentiment and in different state legislatures where bills have already been introduced to establish or require school threat assessment in different jurisdictions. So as schools are facing how to do this, as communities and legislators are considering requiring this, there are examples of places that have done this well. And I encourage you to reach out to people at Salem-Keizer. I also encourage you to access the website for the Virginia School and Campus, Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety, and see what resources they have available and what training events and the like, because they are great guideposts to be able to access. So just wanted to touch on other things that we can do as we talk about building a school threat assessment program. So I mentioned in the beginning that school threat assessment programs work to prevent school violence, but they can work particularly well and particularly effectively in schools where students and employees and parents all feel that there is a positive school climate. So as we think about things that can support school threat assessment, we think about things that can support school climate, and also we think about the role that students and other people can play in helping to make prevention possible. So the first thing that we can do in helping to position a school threat assessment program to work well is getting the message out that everyone in a school or everyone in a school district can play an absolutely critical role in prevention. And this is an important message to emphasize for students themselves, because students often feel like they may hold no power or no ability to affect their environment at schools. And the reality is just the opposite when it comes to school violence prevention. Students, as I mentioned early on, are likely to be the ones who first hear about someone who's talking about or planning to engage in the school shooting. They're often the first ones to hear long before an adult of a student or a friend who may be suicidal. They're often the first to hear about peers facing other problems and struggling in other ways, but oftentimes they may not know what to bring forward. They may be fearful of bringing a report like that forward, fearful that if they do, they're going to get their friend into trouble and things will become worse for them. So they may be struggling with what to do with the information, wanting to be a good friend, not wanting to feel disloyal, not wanting to rat someone out. And one of the messages we know that's very important in encouraging students to come forward with reports of concerns that they know about is to help them understand the difference between sort of tattling and telling. And this is an important concept that can be taught at a young age, that, tattling is something we do. Tattling is what we do if we want to get the other person into trouble. We're making sure an adult knows because we want that person that we are tattling on to get into trouble, to be disciplined, to face some consequence. But telling is something different. Telling is what we do when we're trying to help. Telling is what we do when we're worried about how things will go if we don't speak up and say something. So it can be helpful for students to understand that distinction, that no matter how close they are with their friend, if they're worried about their friend, worried about what they're doing and saying, the best thing they can do is tell, not tattle, but tell, and tell someone who may be able to address it directly. So a school administrator, a school resource officer, the school counselor, a coach, someone they trust, to encourage them to tell. And I think it's important that students know that they may well hear about things that adults don't, because it can be easy to assume that if they know about it, other people, including the school principal or teachers or whomever, may know about it too, but that's often not the case. So it's an important message to make sure students and other bystanders know that they are vital to keeping their schools safe. And if they hear about something that raises concern, they should speak up to someone who can look at it more further. It can also be very helpful to make sure people understand, students and employees alike, that the threat assessment team is not primarily a disciplinary entity. In fact, there are many cases where even if a school could discipline a student, a threat assessment team may say, we need to wait and stabilize the situation first, because if we move to suspend this person or expel this person, that actually will increase risk beyond a level that we can manage right now. So there are times where we absolutely have to suspend students or expel students, but there are times where in-school suspension may be a much better option because we have a chance to continue to work directly with the student and monitor how they're doing and connect them with resources, for example. It can be helpful for people to also understand that we're assessing a situation a student's in, not just the student. We're not profiling the student and declaring them a violent person or a non-violent person. That's archaic thinking, and it serves no purpose. But we're assessing what situation a person may be facing and how to help them handle that situation and navigate it without resorting to violence. It can also help people feel more comfortable reporting when they know that the goal of threat assessment is maintaining safety for everyone, including the person of concern. And it can also encourage people to report when they know that the earlier they get something to a threat assessment team, the more options the threat assessment team may have for intervention if they need to, and oftentimes would have to rely less on punitive options or even criminal justice intervention and more on primarily or exclusively support-focused options. Okay? And that if we don't hear about something, we can't do something, but if we do hear about something, it's a lot more likely that we can do something to help. Now, a number of schools have adopted slogans to encourage students and others throughout the school to report concerning behavior. The one that we have here is one that's probably familiar to many of you, whether you're standing in line at TSA in an airport or have seen this on New York City Metropolitan Transit Authority buses and subways is where this first appeared. But the slogan of "If you see something, say something." Now, it's a slogan that some schools use, and you may need to get permission. I think the slogan is now owned or copyrighted by U.S. Department of Homeland Security, but it can actually be a great exercise for a school to engage their students in developing a similar type of slogan. Let's come up with some great language to encourage people to watch each other's backs, to have each other's backs, to look out for each other, and to say something if they're concerned about a friend. So it can be a great school activity to come up with a contest of developing a slogan that's that's catchy, and that's a good reminder of, if you're worried about someone, make sure you tell an adult, tell someone who might be able to take some action and to help make a situation better. So in addition to finding ways to report concerns, we get back to this aspect of positive school climate and the benefits of positive school climate. So one of the things that we can do in looking at what kind of climate our schools do have is we can actually conduct surveys of our stakeholders, of our students, of our employees, of school board members, parents, visitors, of the community generally, to get their perceptions of how safe their school feels to them. And again, I mean not only physical safety, that things feel safe in the parking lot because it's well lit, but not so much behind the building where some of the external lighting is no longer functioning, for example. Or I feel safe in the hallways, but not in the locker rooms because there usually aren't adults monitoring the locker rooms. So not only physical safety, but also to get perceptions of how emotionally safe or procedurally safe, I could say. If you bring a concern forward, do you think it's going to be handled fairly? Do you feel like you get to share your perspective on something if you're being accused of wrongdoing, or do you feel like it's authoritarian? So we can conduct surveys of all of these different constituent groups on how school feels to them, physically, emotionally, procedurally. And the information that we get, the data that we get from these surveys, can help to guide changes and enhancements we may want to do in our schools. Now, a couple of caveats here. One is that if you are going to do these surveys, I strongly encourage you to publicize the results to your constituent groups, no matter how unflattering they may be. We've seen schools conduct surveys and they haven't been keen on what the findings say, so they haven't publicized them. And that's actually led to greater mistrust, so that people feel like, now the school's hiding something. They asked for our opinions and now they won't even tell us what they found. What are they hiding? So even if the results are unflattering, you can use it as a teaching point and a strategy building jumping off point to say, okay, so we've got some problems. How can we address them together? And how can you get the students involved to think of some creative solutions and implementing those solutions for enhancing climate going forward? And then just a final thought I want to leave you with before we do our wrap up. And that is that one of the things that we know that is incredibly powerful from a protective standpoint, meaning a risk reduction standpoint, is when kids have a connection with an adult, a trustworthy adult that they can rely on. And sometimes it's a parent, but oftentimes it's not. So it could be a coach or a school counselor, or a teacher they like, even a teacher they had a couple of years ago that they still enjoy stopping by to talk to from time to time. It could be the cafeteria worker, it could be the bus driver, someone they feel like they can trust and talk to. We know from large-scale annual surveys about risky behavior among youth, tweens, and teens and young adults across the United States, that having that connection with an adult actually is a significant risk reduction factor, a significant protective factor, making them less likely, far less likely to get involved in not only violence, but self-harm and drug use and gang activity and truancy and a whole host of bad stuff that we would like our kids to avoid. So we can think about simple things that we can do in our schools and in our school districts to foster connectivity between students and adults in the school environment, at least. And there are a number of great examples that are low cost or no cost options, and I wanted to share a couple with you here just as food for thought before we wrap up. So there was one school district that we met with a number of years ago, and I think it may have been in California, but they wanted to develop a program just to enhance connection with their students, to make sure the students knew that they cared about them. And so they did something very simple that cost them no money whatsoever. They established a school-wide program and asked every teacher, every administrator, every staff member, every employee across the school, no matter what their position is in the school, whether it's custodial, administrative assistant, bus driver, whatever, all of these employees who worked in the school and supporting the schools. They asked them to reach out during the course of the day and connect with a couple of students, especially ones that they don't know very well or don't even know their names. So for the teachers and the administrators specifically, they give them a little more structure, and they ask them that, every time the bell would ring and students are going to switch classes from first period to second period to third period, in that little bit of time where people are racing up and down halls to get to their next class, stop and say hi to someone. To a student you know or a student you don't know. Use their name or learn their name and just ask how their day's going. Say hello, ask how their day's going, ask something about their weekend, anything you can think of. Just spend a minute doing that. And that was the extent of the program. That's all that the school asked for their employees to do and to start doing on a regular basis. So for the teachers and administrators especially, they'd have a chance to reach out to and even just say hello to 6, 7, 8 students on a given day. And it started to build these connections and this relationship. And what surprised the school was that after doing this for a couple of weeks, they started to get reports of concerns in from students about a whole host of stuff affecting some of their students that they had had no idea was going on previously. And really, to them, spoke to the fact that they were building trust with their students, that all of a sudden now students were coming to them with problems that they hadn't necessarily reported before, and things that were happening outside of school and not just in school. A student who knew that their friend was being physically abused at home, another student who was pregnant and didn't know how to tell her parents, or didn't know what to do. Other students who were getting lured in by gangs that were approaching them, students who were in financial distress, a student who was homeless and no one knew. So they started to hear all of these different concerns, and the reason that they attributed to this was that they had made this effort to reach out and connect with students. And I think what's important about this example is that their goal in implementing this very simple no-cost program was not, we want to get more information from our students. It was, we want our students to know that we care about them, period, end of sentence. But they started to get a wealth of information as a result of showing and demonstrating that care to those students. There's another example that I liked when I heard about it. This was another school that was worried about the students who were sort of invisible or maybe at risk of falling through the cracks, of people overlooking the student for various reasons. And so on a semester basis, they take a professional day, one of their professional days, and they will line their hallways with those giant Post-it notes, things that kind of can stick to the walls on themselves, and they will list out every student in the school alphabetically. And then every teacher and administrator gets a sheet of stickers, and they have to go up and down the list and put stickers by names where when they see the name, they can picture the face. It's not just, oh, that name seems familiar, but I know who that student is. Maybe they don't know them well, maybe they've never taught them, but they can picture who that student is. I know who that student is. I know who you're talking about. And then administrators take those lists at the beginning of each semester and look at the students whose names have the fewest stickers next to them. And they assign those students sort of invisible mentors. They assign faculty and staff to just reach out to those students and keep an eye on them a little bit more, because they're known to the fewest adults in the school, and they want to make sure that they don't stay that way, that they do feel like there are people they can trust, or have people reach out to them and make a little bit more effort with those students. So that's a low-cost program, but it does, cost some large pieces of paper and a bunch of stickers, but also a great example. And then the final example, just before we wrap up, is actually from a story I've seen circulating on Facebook, and had seen it circulating a number of years ago as well. The example of I think it's a kindergarten teacher or an elementary school teacher, who would ask her students in her class, to submit a private list every couple of weeks about who they wanted to sit near for the next couple of weeks. She would rearrange the classroom so students would sit in groupings of desks near other students, and she'd change it up every so often, but she would ask students for their input before she would make those changes. And the detail in the story, as I saw circulated, and what's most important here, is that her goal in doing so was not to necessarily give students their choice of who they wanted to sit with. It was to look for patterns of which students were requested least often. Which students did other students never want to sit near, or never think to ask to sit near? And then she would find ways and resources and strategies to help get those students, the one listed least often, connected better with other students in the class and involved in other activities throughout the school. So they had the benefit of that connection with adults and especially with peers. So there are great examples like this throughout the country, and I share a couple of these here with you now just as food for thought. And just want to leave you with a couple of closing comments before we wrap up. From the research that we've done on school shootings around the country, and from working actual cases, we know it is possible to prevent school shootings. And I'm not saying that this will guarantee us preventing every single school shooting, but having a school threat assessment process in place is really recognized as best practice for being the best available tool we have to try to prevent a school shooting, to be able to look into concerning behavior when we get a report of someone overhearing a threat, or seeing something troubling on social media, or being worried about how a student or someone else is functioning, for example. Having a multidisciplinary team is extremely helpful. Having some procedures that a team can follow and having high quality threat assessment training sets up a team and a program to succeed and to handle these situations well. And that there are things we can do on the sidelines to encourage reporting, to enhance a school's climate, to foster more connectivity, and we can even think about engaging in threat assessment at a community level as well as at a school-based level. I just want to remind you of the resources that we highlighted here, the final report and findings of the Safe School Initiative and the Guide to Threat Assessment in Schools. And again, both of those are available as free PDFs, and I encourage you to access them and read through them. There are also lots of other resources available, and again, the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety is a great resource to look for model policy and procedures, training, and the like. So as Brianna mentioned, we will be taking questions offline, and we will produce a follow-up document on frequently asked questions and answers. There's also contact information here if you have questions before then, or other questions that we don't have don't answer in those FAQs. So I want to thank you very much for the time and attention you've given to this topic and to the care you are giving to students in your schools and in your districts. So thank you very much, and Brianna, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Randazzo. Thank you for sharing all of that wealth of information, practical application, and all of the great research that you've been a part of. For the rest of you, don't forget that if you haven't downloaded those handouts, they're going to go away when we end this webinar, so you find that in the handouts. Download those now. Thank you for attending this webinar, and please look out for future webinars on psba.org. Have a great night.